Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, glad to connect with you all. So, if I had to think of one common thread in my life, it has been just obsession with the visual world, with images, and escapism of it. So, grew up in an immigrant home, not a super happy one, but my dad was really supportive of me. And I think he really wanted a son because, he loved to fiddle with mechanical things, technology, cameras, and I loved all that. And I loved anything visualizing, from being a nerd playing chess to fixing bicycles to playing with old cameras. So in college, I took photography classes. I learned darkroom. I just shot. And part of me wanted to be a scientist and part of me wanted to be a photographer. And boy, it took me a long time to meld those two sides of myself. So I ended up going to medical school, and that's a little bit of a tough story, best told over alcoholic beverages. But, I was first year medical student and I was doing some research and a summer internship in Chicago. And my mom said, my second cousin lives in Chicago and she and her husband are going to have you over for dinner. Well, her husband turned out to be Robert Beck, who was a renowned physicist who developed the first positron emission tomograph for functional brain imaging at the University of Chicago. So he and I had a great time and he showed me all these images and I was just fascinated by what they could show about how the brain works and just the technology of them. So, my dad really wanted me to go to medical school and I didn't get into the school he wanted, which was Johns Hopkins. And I was on the wait list and was backpacking before I was ready to go to another place, backpacking with friends way out there. And I got a message from my dad, and it wasn't by cell phone then, and he said, "Oh, you got into Hopkins, congratulations." And I thought, gee, did I want to go there? Well, being a very strong male immigrant head of the household, he went down and met with the dean of students and forged my signature. So that's how I went to medical school. And since I had no money, I used to volunteer for every possible experiment that they would do on humans. And, I found out they were doing some of the first PET imaging, this positron emission tomography, which allowed you to look at the brain's function. How cool was that? So I volunteered with them and then sort of nagged the scientists until they let me play with them in the laboratory. And it was a tough environment back then. Hopkins was really where men are men and giants walk the halls. And everything was sort of soaked in this hierarchy in medicine, this male hierarchy. And, this is the famous John Singer Sargent's The Four Doctors. And he portrayed the four sort of founders, Halsted and Welsh. And this was always in my mind, that these are what founding physicians look like. And if you were a good medical student, you got patted on the head and called a stud. So it was very interesting growing up in this very male-dominated field at a time that's different from today, although slowly changing. And, I still photographed in medical school, and in my graduation from medical school, I had an exhibit of my photographs, and somebody stole my camera a few years after that. And since I had no money, and I went without a camera for a long time and thought, well, I'm going to go into brain imaging and study radiology and neuroradiology and look at images of the brain. And that's just my scientific medical transformation into imaging. So I didn't photograph for a while. And there was something about then, if you weren't 24/7, all in, sleep deprived constantly, then you weren't giving enough to medicine and science. And especially if you were a woman, you had to work twice as hard. So after my training, I went to the University of Pittsburgh and had the good fortune to work with David Townsend, who's a renowned physicist. And he was doing this fascinating work of putting structural imaging, CAT scans, the machine that develops CAT scans, in conjunction and making a single scanner with this positron emission tomography or functional scanner. And so I worked with him. I got to play with this new technology and discover what it could do. And this technology got into Time magazine in 2000 as an invention of the year. And in my 15 minutes of fame as an assistant professor with a quote in here, but nobody actually read the article because it was in the back of, this was the cover of that Time magazine. So I don't think anyone actually got to that story. And I was always fascinated by, we had these cool tools like MRI to look at the brain. And I had a friend who was also very interested in behavior and how we can image, what goes wrong when there's disease of the brain, when there's psychiatric disease. So, he would give me a hard time when I'd, read an MRI and the report would be, this is a normal brain. And he said, well, the patient has schizophrenia. So they don't act normal at all. So why are you not figuring that out? So I got interested in technology that was sort of earlier machine learning, which we do more around less rigid technologies now with artificial intelligence, but trying to figure out what we could glean from images in terms of their texture and technical aspects of them, and being able from an MRI, which did not look at brain function, separate out the brains of schizophrenics from the brains of normal people. Also got very interested in giving you a little background of my medical imaging of why we can't make a diagnosis of some diseases before people die. Alzheimer's disease affects so many people in the US and worldwide. And for pathologists, it's a really easy diagnosis. This is what the brain looks like with all these abnormal proteins in Alzheimer's disease. And somebody who did not have Alzheimer's disease, it's clear of these protein accumulations. But these people are dead. So how does that help us to really understand a disease and treat it and develop therapies if we can't make a diagnosis until people die? And I did have the pleasure of working with scientists who developed a way of imaging those proteins. So being able to make that diagnosis of Alzheimer's even 10 years before someone had the clinical diagnosis. So this is the kind of work I did medically, and it was fascinating and satisfied my cravings for imaging, but I always had it in the back of my mind that I wanted to be a photographer, and someday I was going to be a photographer. And I would shoot, but not seriously. And I had a life-changing event that made me really rethink things. And forgive me for showing a picture of a tick after dinner, but this is a Lone Star tick that carried a disease, Southern tick-associated rash illness, that had just been described by the CDC. And of course, I had a tick bite and developed this and got very, very sick and was hospitalized. And nobody could figure out what was going on. But I thought I was going to die. I mean, I was as sick as I've ever been in my life, and thought I wouldn't recover. And luckily, I was treated and it was great, and thank goodness. But there's a gift of a near-death experience that makes you rethink priorities in life. And maybe a lot of us have kind of gone through that with COVID, that kind of catastrophe that really makes you realign priorities. So right after that, when I was sort of recuperating at home, I said, I'm going back to photography. I'm going to figure out a way to do it. And soon after the Emory, I was at Emory at that point, where I am now. And, you know, they did a magazine about the secret lives of faculty. And nobody that I worked with knew I was a photographer. I had a show in town and invited a lot of folks from work. And they just said, we didn't even know you did this. And I was so nervous about sort of melding those parts of my life that I'd kept so separately, but gradually let myself be a photographer. It's what I wanted to do. I started out really looking at the micro details of nature in a way that kind of fit my OCD, you know, brain imaging radiologist, but much softer and trying to capture the creative side of nature, not the, you know, sort of very technical, detailed structural and functional images of the brain that I was used to looking at for my profession. And I like to look at, to show people the world in a different way, in a way where they couldn't quite figure out what they were looking at, but something captured them. This is a photograph. It's not an oil painting. So I played with a lot of techniques and really let myself get into it. But I then, several years later, returned to my first love, which was really black and white. I love the majesty of black and white. It's harder to shoot in black and white. You're eliminating the colors as you compose and looking at the luminance and trying to make something beautiful without the way we look at the world, which is through our color vision. And again, trying to take nature in a way that doesn't kind of look like what it is. Maybe there's a different life to this leaf. It's at the end of its life. You know, looking at small details, not busy composition. So I love the artistry, but also the technology of photography. So part of photography is just composing in your head, composing in your brain, and composing in the viewfinder of the camera. And how do you compose? You look at a scene and you decide that there's some artistry in that it captures you a certain way. There's math to that. There's a lot of math in nature. The rule of thirds. The golden triangle. So there is a proportion of many things in nature that take us to the way leaves branch, the way flora develop, the way vines grow. And there's something visually appealing because of the way nature is geometrically constructed, that we find this very pleasing, this golden triangle. So you don't quite realize that's what you're doing. But I had an instructor once. I was working with a photographer who taught me a lot about what I was looking at and why I found it appealing, and made me compose better, I think. And broaden my view to landscape. And I just love clouds, love the way these kinds of photographs show how small we are in the world. This big question mark. What's before us? We're down here. So where's our place in the world? Of course, this kind of looks like neurons, so this appealed to me as well, but just that these branching patterns, again, are from those mathematical formulas. But we don't think of math when we look at this. We think of connection. We think of, we're drawn in. This is a photograph I composed in Alaska. It's a riverbed with a dead tree at the bottom of this shallow riverbed and a living tree superimposed on top of it. You know, sometimes I show the names of the photographs and sometimes I don't. And sometimes it's better not to, for you to put your own meaning to what this is and trying to figure out, is this a double exposure? No. Is this, how is this done? What does it mean? New life on top of old life. The road to nowhere. Again, about these kinds of scenes are about how small we are in the world and where we're going. This photograph I just took, captured 2 weeks ago. So this is a forest that's really pickled from the ocean and erosion. And boy, do you feel the force of nature when you see these trees just in the ocean, just littered around the beach. This was in Scotland. Again, these sort of big sky, and you know, we're the folks who are kind of at the mercy of the weather, of what's happening in nature. And I think with climate change, we're all realizing that we don't have a lot of control over these forces. To me, this, again, a pathway. I like to lead people in. This looks like you're headed toward maybe a city in the distance. And I hope that it makes you feel pulled in to go explore. What is this? I can't quite see it. It is rare for a photographer to feel like they've made a great capture. They shoot, and then say, I hope I got a good shot. This was in Cuba, in a farmhouse, and I was looking in a different direction. I turned around just as this chick was walking into the light coming from the door. And I just got one shot in, and I knew that there was something really special about this. I call it leaving home. Again, a doorway, a pathway. What's next? I happen to love animals, and you may hear one of my 4 dogs or all 4 of them barking at the same time. But I love the thought of communicating with animals through photography. We can't quite know what they're thinking and feeling all the time, but we certainly communicate with them. Odd friends right here. They seem to certainly enjoy one another's company. Certainly, primates are the closest to us, and are so communicative in so many ways. So I've always been fascinated by primates, and primates in other animals in captivity. I mean, I shot this a number of years ago, but I still remember looking at this capuchin monkey at a wildlife refuge and thinking he was trying to tell me something about his captivity. Primates at the zoo. I think this one's ordering a latte, but not quite sure. And of course, animals free and the joy of it. Animals aren't great at posing, so you have to really use a pretty fast shutter speed. So like science, you know, I've loved following tangents and different styles and collaborators. That's what we do in science, is collaborate. Seek others who do something different. How can we meld those thoughts and those ideas? So I've been very lucky to work with several artists, rather. Ann Patterson is a renowned artist in New York, and we met by happenstance. But we did a series together called Inspiration Echoed, where initially I had photographed some things and then she did a watercolor to it. And then we did the opposite echo, where she would paint something and I would look for something reminiscent in nature, and we paired these and they were framed together. And this is probably one of the hardest projects we did together. She was, gosh, I'm going to blank on the name. It's a medical term where she sees music. She sees music in colors and forms, and did this watercolor series called The Color of Music. And then I photographed to echo it, and to echo the colors, the sentiment, the forms, the shapes, and called it the seeing music. And then she echoed off of that and painted I had done, and the series went on. These are very big pieces. Also the pleasure to collaborate with two poets, Sophia and Ali. We did this a number of years ago, but we're just talking about potentially doing another book. She's very simplistic, but very moving prose. And I worked to pair we worked together to pair photographs with the feeling of what she is offering in the prose. And we did a show, a couple of shows, pairing them physically. Influences, I mentioned Catherine Kolb. So she is an artist in Atlanta who just understands the geometry of natural forms in a very intense way. And really, that's what she shoots, is the geometry of forms in ways that are so captivating. And she also talked to me about intuitive seeing, you know, composing in your head, and getting in the zone. There are a few things in our busy lives that will take us into a zone where we do not think about anything else we do. And for me, photographing is like that, as it was for Catherine. Nick Brandt, who I don't know, was an incredible photographer of the wild, and just the dignity and grace of animals that he captures, I've always been fascinated by. Vivian Meyer. Vivian Meyer is an incredible story. Maybe some of you have heard of her. So just a few years ago, the story came out where this was really an undiscovered photographer who had passed away in poverty. She was from France and worked in the States as an au pair for several families. And Phil Donahue's family at one point in Chicago and New York. And she would go around photographing, and she would actually, and when you think of the geometry of the street photography here and the triangles, the multiple triangles that just draw you in, This was all rolls of undeveloped film. And there was just, not the 25 shots that most photographers take to try to capture something the way they want to. It's one shot, one moment captured. Those rare events that I've experienced, that's what she lived. And she used to drag the kids she was sitting for into like the Bowery and the, sort of, so she could shoot, these earthy street scenes. And she got a little wacky later on in life, but I own one of her photographs, and it's just a privilege to have it in my home. Another influence is Bob Gomel. So Bob Gomel, who's living, he's still photographing. He was a Life magazine photojournalist. He took famous pictures that you would recognize of, Kennedy and the Beatles. And oops, who knows which, I don't know if there's a chat here, but what film this photograph, this famous photograph of Bob Gomel's, was recently featured and was replayed, sort of reenacted. Maybe I've seen it.
I do. I watched it.
We're guessing.
On Netflix. It was on Netflix. No, maybe it was Amazon Prime. Oh God.
A Night in Miami. A Night in Miami.
Yes.
Malcolm
yes,
X,
yes,
the
yes.
camera taking a picture of Muhammad Ali. And this is hanging in our home because Bob Gomel is a lifelong friend of my mother-in-law. They're dear friends, and they grew up together. And he sent us this photograph for to have in our home. And we've communicated regularly about photography, but I still have not met him. He's in Houston. So after the pandemic, I want to go meet him. So I always loved street photography. And I would always say, I'm a macro photographer. I'm a landscape photographer. I don't do that. Gee, I love street, but I can't do it. And I think what's been fun about this journey is just saying, why can't I do it? Why can't I explore further? So in the last few years, I've been doing a lot of street photography. And that's sort of, very different from standing in a field with a tripod trying to capture the expanse of something, but to capture moments like this, instantaneous moments. I also love it for political expression. And I do a lot of photographing at marches and rallies and other things. And this is from the first Women's March in DC. This is from a couple of years ago in DC at another march. And these two sides of an issue are just looking in a different direction. And this police officer is trying to manage the crowd, is just sort of holding them in divide. And back to medicine a little bit. So does anyone know what this is? What this depicts?
No idea.
No.
It's from Milledgeville in southern Georgia, which was one of the largest in what was called asylums that housed psychiatric patients for years and not in the best conditions. And these are numbered grave markers, and they coat the hillside. We don't know who these people are, but they have no identity other than a number. So I actually published this in a medical journal, which sort of depicts the human side of these forgotten patients at a time we didn't have the tools to treat them.
I have how big are those individually? Like, what is the scale of that?
They're probably like 2 feet high,
Oh,
narrow
okay.
and like 2 feet high.
Gotcha.
but just, you can see them on the hillside and you go, what is that? I purposely did it with a very soft focus because they just fade into anonymity. And that's what's so moving about being there.
That's amazing. I thought they were like an inch high.
Yeah, I thought that's why I asked. I thought they were very small. Interesting.
Yeah, and I do like to photograph in a way you can't tell the scale sometimes. And yeah, where is that? How big is that? So thanks for asking that question. So I'm gonna end this part with a photograph that's from this sort of Dreaming in Color series that I did, which were reflections of color and black and white. And this is called Life Underground. And I like this Salman Rushdie quote: "The accidents of my life have given me the ability to make stories in which different parts of the world are brought together, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes in conflict, and sometimes both, usually both." Thank you so much for letting me share my story. I'm glad to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Your work is really beautiful and your compositions are so well crafted. So thank you for sharing that with us. Does anyone have any questions from the audience?
I will personally just say, I feel like sometimes, and maybe it's the photography that I've watched or seen, doesn't portray as much emotion, and it's amazing to me how the emotion comes out in your photography. So that's an amazing skill. So thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you so much. That really is my goal, to evoke something that connection with our world in a different way we haven't looked at it before.
I also want to ask, so you spend a lot of time imaging things inside of the body for work, but when you're photographing trees or other things in nature, do you see any similarities in structures and forms between the two?
Yeah, sometimes I do. And I do have, so for this route, that's the surface route at the top of a mountain that was pretty good climb. To me, this looks like a neuron, as well. And is it, as a neuron spreads, a brain cell spreads its branches and makes connections in our mind. That's what this reminds me of. So I must say, I do have that sort of eye for something that reminds me of the medical part of imaging as well.
Awesome. Also, as a female doctor and artist, you mentioned that these fields were really male dominated when you first started out. How do you feel about that now?
Well, I actually spend a lot of my time now working on diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice in STEM fields. My field of radiology, of imaging, has a lot of physics in it. There are a lot of biomedical engineers. It is a field to which women have not been, let's say, channeled. And that's changing, but still it's, and what we see as more young people and these STEM programs and support programs and pipeline programs bring more diversity into the entry-level positions in our field, that it doesn't always translate to leadership. It takes a long, long time. So people say, well, we got to build the pipeline. So I'm a chair of a radiology department. Only about 15% of chairs of radiology departments are women. That's a pretty small number. For women to have parity as deans of medical schools, if we look at the current trajectory, it will take 50 more years. So we're
Wow.
not, it's not a pipeline issue, it's other things, it's other systemic biases that are built into our fields and our world. And, you know, we see it with systemic racism, systemic gender bias. So I could talk about that for a long time, but I've become passionate over time, over my whole career, really, about opening doors and breaking down hurdles.
That's great, and you can definitely see that in some of the later images that you showed. Are there any more questions from the audience?
Not a question, just wow.
Oh, thank you so much.
Good job.
Yeah, really incredible work.
Well, thank you so much, Carolyn. This was awesome.
Well, I'm grateful. I apologize for the difficulty at the beginning, but it's been an honor to be with you tonight.
No, we've loved your presentation, so thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for coming tonight.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you.
Very good.
Bye.